I'm Peggy Olislaegers, and it's time for B.Motion Connects. Today, I'm in dialogue with Theresa Ruth Howard, and I met her in 2016 when I was preparing the International Ballet Conference, Positioning Ballet, organized by Dutch National Ballet. She was one of the keynote speakers, and she made quite an impression. I'm in dialogue with her since 2016, and we became friends. Theresa is a former member of Dance Theatre of Harlem, and she also danced with Carole Armitage. She's a founder and curator of Memoirs of Blacks in Ballet, and she also writes for Dance Magazine USA. But most of all, she's one of the leading diversity strategists working in the world of ballet and opera. And she works with companies in the USA and Canada, but also with companies in Europe. I'm very happy that I can be in dialogue with her today. Theresa, hi.
Hello.
Hello. Hey, last week when I spoke to you, I said to you, hey, Theresa, can you introduce yourself when we have our interview next week? And you said, introducing myself feels reductive. So can you introduce yourself?
Okay, so I did think about this. And it does, because I think that when we introduce people, we put them in a box in a way. Like when you read somebody's bio in a program, it's usually to prepare you for something that you're supposed to see. It sets the stage or the context. Or if you're looking at somebody on stage and then you're like, oh, let me check the bio because you want to prove something, right, about what you're seeing. And I just like to be taken in the moment. I'm very Buddhistic that way. You know, it's the here and now. But I did find my old bio that I used when I danced for Carole Armitage because I was so against bios. So here it goes. It's Theresa Ruth Howard, all you really need to know. Theresa likes to be alone, lives in her head, is the same today as she was at 3, is intrigued by words, loves children, laughter, and orchids, sees movement in music, shapes, and structures, loves Baker, Parker, Callis, and Erte, loves straight lines, spirals upwards, dreams often, sleeps little, talks to spirits, takes their advice.
And this is something that you wrote earlier, no? When you were dancing?
Oh, this was like decades ago. But you know what's really funny? When I found it, I haven't looked at it in like literally almost a decade. And all of it is still pretty true. Pretty true. I mean, there are other things that I love that I would probably add in now, but all of that's pretty true. Hey, and I think that's all you really need to know about me.
Okay. But still, if you had to add something right now, you know, knowing you and your work, what would you add today?
I would add that integrity is my superpower.
Integrity.
That's a big statement.
That's a big statement. Okay. So let's continue talking. Integrity is your superpower. Here you are, you know, a specialist working worldwide on equity and diversity. Your field is ballet and dance and opera. How on earth do you make sure that integrity echoes through your being all the time? Because that's not obvious, no? That's a practice. How do you do that?
You know, it's very funny because I've always had this relationship with the idea of integrity even before I knew the word, right? And I think, and I've actually tried to like trace its lineage in me because it's so intense that I would say, this has to come from somewhere. I think a part of it might come from my father. He was a person that instilled in me, if you say you're going to do something, then you do it. Like you're only as good as your word. And that if you start something, you're going to finish it, right? That you show up, that people are that you engage with people as you would want them to engage with you. And so it's just a daily practice for me. I don't like contradictions, right? And I remember in my 20s, I actively worked to not have contradiction in my life, right? And so it is really a daily practice. And most of the time, I'm pretty good at it right now, but you do fail. But the point is that you're always striving to be in that space.
But isn't that exhausting? I mean, you're describing something very primal, something that asks you to stay rooted in the here and now. I know people who strive for that, but are very exhausted on a regular basis.
Oddly, that does not exhaust me. I find when other people are not in their integrity, that exhausts me. I think that because it is a daily practice, right? I just have built up stamina. I guess it would be something akin to like a runner, right? Like you build up to running a marathon. And when that becomes a norm, it's just a part of your beingness.
So how do you deal with people who are in front of you and you need to work with, because, for instance, they invited you to work on equality, and you think, where's your integrity? How do you deal with that?
I don't think it's my responsibility to hold.
Theresa Ruth Howard, explain that further.
It's not my responsibility. I see it very much like the way that I teach, right? My responsibility as a teacher is to come in, be fully present, communicate well, give accurate information, right? And engage with students a certain way. The student has their own responsibility. I can't control anybody else. I control me. So when I'm in those spaces, I stand in my integrity, hopefully modeling a way of being energetically, right? And actually physically. And hopefully it will draw people into their own sense of integrity. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it sounds simple, but it's probably not simple at all.
I only experience it from one side, right? I've never been on the other side of me. I know how people engage with me, but I mean, you would be a better person to ask the effect of it, right? Because I don't experience it that way. I just work on being my authentic self in spaces, even when it's hard to be. Sometimes it's hard to be your authentic self. Like when we did positioning ballet that first time, and I'm in a room with international artistic directors and very powerful people, and in my heart and soul, I'm still just a ballet dancer who's, like artistic directors elicit that hold your breath and stand, by the wall so they can pass sort of thing, right? That hierarchical sort of power structure. That's still within me. And it takes a lot for me to summons up the energy to remember who I am and present myself as my authentic self, and not to be afraid to take up space, energetically, emotionally, physically, everything, to be absolutely present in my fullest self.
Yeah. Is that a core element in a practice needed in order to strive for equality, to train the ability to take space?
I think so. I mean, I remember when I was probably about 21, I remember a moment when I was conscious of making myself smaller to make someone else feel comfortable with me. And in that moment, I was like, oh, wow, I'm not ever going to do that again. Like, your comfort is not my responsibility, right? And in Blackness, that's not always the case, right? Black people are often required to help white people feel comfortable with the presence of Blackness, or just period, feel comfortable, right? If you look at the legacy of enslaved people, right? Black people, that was actually their life duty, was for the comfort of white people,
Yeah.
essentially, right? So to answer your question, I do feel like taking space, like being your fullest embodiment is a stance for equity and equality, right? Um, I I assume my equality, period. Like it's not until someone else tells you that you're not equal that you realize, oh, that's how you feel about it, right? But I innately assume that. And in that, I understand that in and of itself is a privilege, right? That's a part of a privilege that I have, you know.
In what sense is that a privilege, Theresa, that you feel that you are equal?
Because everybody doesn't automatically feel that,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? That's just not, that is an assumption based on privilege
Yeah, I
that
know.
everyone feels themselves equal. So privilege doesn't come in one size or color. Like it's not just white and male, right? They're all different aspects of privilege: education, wealth. You can just have access to healthcare. All these things are privileges, and they're on different levels. And so I enjoy a number of privileges that allows me to walk in spaces like a room at Positioning Ballet and assume my equality.
Yeah. Cool. Hey, you're working with white people like me, and you're working with brown and black colleagues.
Yes.
So let's first talk about you working with institutes, white institutes, and white people working within these institutes. Um, how do you try to tickle them, to shake their asses a little bit?
I don't know if they would call it a tickle. Sometimes, more like a slap and a tickle. Wow, it was by accident that I fell into this position. I wrote an article about the narrative of, or the erasure of Black ballet history, or the lack of it being lifted up. And this sort of was in the midst of the beginning stages of this diversity, equity, and inclusion, as we call it here in the States, conversation in ballet. So I was asked to speak in different ways. And the thing that I was clear about, Peggy, was that I wanted to have a different type of conversation about diversity, right? I felt like it's not a new conversation. We've had it for years, decades, whatever, centuries. But the thing that, I swear I know something that the rest of the world doesn't know. But the thing that I realized was that we were having it a very particular sort of way. So Black people would come into the room, like white and Black people would come into this space. Black people would share do the emotional labor, share their experiences, the pain, the frustration, the anger. White people would get defensive, feel blamed and shamed, and, the famous, white woman, I feel attacked, right? Like I feel attacked, which is not really true. You feel confronted. That's a whole other conversation. But I wanted to inject empathy into the conversation, humanity into the conversation, so that people could, in the exchange, create a human understanding, right, of what it felt like to be brown or Black in these spaces of whiteness. And so I get them to move from their headspace, that intellectual or organizational lens of like, oh, how does this work for our organization, into a very personal heart space, right? Where they can actually feel what this work means.
So how do you invite people to start feeling, especially people who are trained to see that as the opposite of professional?
I think this is where it gets a little, I use my personality. I use a little bit of humor. I use a lot of irony. I like to point out the things that we take for granted, or we don't even think about, especially in the culture of ballet specifically, right?
Can you give an
when
example?
we were, well, absolutely. So, and this was something that I learned the first time that we actually met at Positioning Ballet. I was talking to Michaela DePrince, and the Gaynor Minden Company had just come out with the 3 shades of shoes. And sorry, that's my dog in the background. If you hear her. So Gaynor Minden had come out with the 3 shades of shoes, and she was remarking on it. She was like, oh my God, thank God. It takes so much time and energy to pancake my shoes. And so it clicked for me that just the very tools of the art form are exclusionary to certain people, right? The idea that they don't make organic space or recognize the possibility that someone that doesn't look like that skin tone might be in the form is something that we don't actually think about, right? Because we take it for granted. It's pink tights, it's pink shoes, it's ballet. But what subtextually does that mean?
So was it 2016, 17 that for the first time, different colors than pink, thinking of tights and ballet shoes were introduced?
Actually, no. Okay, so Dance Theater of Harlem, and I know the answer to this question. Dance Theater of Harlem, on one of their first European tours, actually, it started in the UK, and they went around Europe, and they were so, they were backed by popular demand. They were asked back to the UK at the end of the tour. And so they start this tour, so I think it might have been 71. They started the tour. By the time they get back to the UK, they were wearing brown tights. And there was a dancer named Yanchi Stevenson who actually trained, she had a fabulous career with the ALE. She was a Rockette. She trained at SAB, went on to dance at Washington Ballet, and then Dance Theater of Harlem, always said to Mr. Mitchell, we should be wearing brown tights. We should be wearing brown tights. One day he saw her and it was like clicked for him. So Dance Theater of Harlem in the 70s introduced this. But then, interestingly enough, Capezio, the point shoe company, actually started making shoes in different shades of brown in the 80s. And then they stopped because of lack of demand.
That's interesting. So perhaps it was not obvious to wear them, and as a result, there was not that high of demand.
Right. Well, there was just probably, only Dance Theater of Harlem at that time was wearing the brown tights. Yeah. It wasn't until later in the 90s that in Houston Ballet, Lauren Anderson began to wear the brown tights. Ben Stephen, the artistic director there, was like, you look strange. And started putting her in brown tights. And then for her principal and her soloist roles, she then wore brown tights.
So if you discuss this when you are in a room with people in a ballet company, how does this help to open up the hearts of people who till then see diversity as something conceptual? How do you again help them to bring in their vulnerability to a certain degree?
I think that the idea of exclusion, right? The idea that it's something that you took for granted, right? Which is sort of the baseline for privilege, right? Like you don't even think about it. It's a benefit that you get. You don't earn it. It's just there for you. So things like tights or hair are very tangible, like they're visual things, right? It's not a feel. I always say it's a fact that you feel, but feelings aren't facts, right? So it's a very visual thing that you don't have to, it's not a stretch of imagination into a feeling. It's like, look at it and you see, oh, that could affect a person a certain way.
Yeah.
And I think that just generally, ballet has never been that reflective, right? I always say, and I'm waiting to get in trouble, but I always say that ballet is the least intellectual of the Western dance arts, right? It's the art form that asks the least questions, like, why do we do this? Right?
Is that true, or is it just not shared outside of the ballet realm?
I personally think it's not true. I mean, I think it's true. I think that it's not reflective on things like gender. It's very hierarchical and patriarchal, right? Where it's a very small lens that it looks through, right? And usually it's the male, it's the white lens, and it assumes authority.
Hey, but Theresa, I hear you. But I also know working with you that you love ballet. You are deeply in love with ballet. How on earth are you connecting these two things? Because we talked about integrity. Woman, how are you doing this?
But the art, that's not the art. That's the system. That's the culture of it. Right. And so I, as a Black woman, American Black woman, am used to living on the fringe of society, right? Or in the shadow of society, where people of color generally have their parallel societies, if you will, right? So everything that you have in white society, you have in an encapsulated Black society, right? White people don't know about this because that's the privilege. You don't have to know. But in these alternate parallel societies of color and culture, we are bound to understand everything about the white culture, right? So I can engage in things that don't necessarily invite me in, and I can enjoy them, right? Different types of music, different types of food, different types of art. It's not for me to have to stretch, right?
Mm.
It's for it to stretch.
Mm.
So once the lens of ballet, right, and the gatekeepers of that culture begin to shift and the lens, the aperture opens up, then, we're going to be in that panoramic sort of world where it is more inclusive. I don't know if that answered your question.
You're always, it's important what you're saying. If I ask you now, what is dance and ballet for you? What does it represent for you when you open your heart and you connect to everything that you did on stage? What is that dance form so deeply rooted in certain structures, like you said, or cultures for you?
For me, it is the actual science of the technique. I love the science of the technique. Like the idea that the people who were creating it weren't thinking about creating a science of the body, right? But they were, and it's so beautiful and balanced. I love symmetry, and I love the idea of it being a perfect physical puzzle. Like, it's a physical puzzle. You just got to figure out like what goes where and how you get that to work. But I love the idea that that ballet is the only form that has a name for the body in space. En face, effacé, écarté. Like other forms don't have that sort of relationship, understanding to the relationship of space. So they're really cool things that are in there. Do I subscribe to the aesthetics of ballet all the time, the stylistic aesthetics? Not necessarily. Like I'm American in the truest sense, which means we're just like sort of a mashup of everything. And so at Dance Theater of Harlem, we were, as Arthur Mitchell would say, classically American in that way. We were more about the dynamics of the movement than the actual quote unquote style, be that RAD or Vaganovo or Cicchetti. I can appreciate them all, but for me, it's how the movement actually feels when you're doing it. It's not the tights, it's not the color of the pointe shoes, it's not how your hair is, it's the actual movement. It's
Yeah. I feel you. Yeah.
In fact, I said that like once I wrote that contemporary ballet was the liberation movement for the ballerina, was the women's liberation movement for the ballerina.
Can you say that once more?
That contemporary ballet is the women's liberation movement for the ballerina, right? Because it allowed her to show her skin, like everybody's dancing half naked in contemporary ballet. She could have tattoos. Her body could be any shape or size. She could have any type of hair, like short hair, bald head, locks and afro. All of those things could be embodied in the contemporary ballerina, and she could still have the use of all that beautiful technique in the genre and the extrapolation.
Mm.
So she's everything all at once.
Mm-hmm. Hey, talking about being everything all at once and connecting that to the word humanity, because you use that once more. Last week, you said to me, I exercise my humanity on overdrive. We're talking about, because we're in dialogue quite often now these weeks, the last months, and we were referring to Black Lives Matter, and you said, woman, I exercise my humanity on overdrive. Because you are in dialogue with a lot of people right now, and also younger colleagues, helping them or supporting them in the practice that is related to striving for equality. How do you do that? What is that, exercising your humanity on overdrive? How do you do that?
I think it's staying in that heart space, right? Is always injecting a bit of empathy and compassion into whatever it is that I'm doing, whatever conversation I'm having. I'm always working to see somebody else's perspective. You know what I mean? Like I don't know if that answers the question, but for me, that's how I connect with people. It's like I have to get into your mind, into your headspace, so that I can understand where you're coming from, and then I can help move us potentially closer and closer and closer, right? We don't necessarily have to agree, but I think that understanding the opposite perspective is vastly important. And then we begin to negotiate, okay, this is your belief, this is mine. How do we move them closer and closer together? They don't have to match. We do not have to be the same. We have to respect, right, other people's perspectives, their experiences, their feelings. And every place isn't a space for feelings, but that doesn't mean they're not important. And so that's sort of how I tried to do it. I have to put myself in somebody else's headset. I remember being at the ballet, and I was sitting with Wendy Perrin, who was then the editor-in-chief of Dance Magazine in America. And we used to do these video reviews. They were called see and says. We go see something and then we'd say what we saw. And the curtain goes up, and it is the most spectacular display of whiteness that I have ever seen. Like, it was really white. And I looked at it and I was like, if I was a part of that, I would want to preserve it too. Like, I get it. I completely understand the desire to preserve. It's almost like a commitment to whiteness, right? Ballet was. I said was because I think that we're moving away from that. This was probably almost 10 or so years ago. So I understand it, but that doesn't mean that I can't interrogate it. And it doesn't mean that I have to accept it, right? That can be placed somewhere. It doesn't mean that it needs to be preserved, right? In a way that is exclusionary. You can acknowledge it and go, wow, but those two things can't occupy the same space.
I know working with you that you really invest into the perspective of the other. And you said earlier to me that you can do that because in your 20s and early 30s, you really did deep research on you.
Yes, I have a PhD in me. I do. I do. I mean, and I didn't understand it at the time. I was just moving through my life, and like I said, I was really trying to understand what was this thing, this obsession that I had with integrity. Like, I was always trying to dig deeper and understand. Maybe I felt like I was broken, so I was trying to fix something. Like you're seeking, like, what can I do? But invariably, I ended up really at this incredible level of clarity about myself. And let's call it a Peggy practice of clarity, right? Because it always changes. Like you're constantly changing. But I had tools to check in, right, to what was shifting and changing in me, and ask myself, like, why do I take nothing in myself for granted? Like I'm always asking, why is that? Where did that come from? Well, that's just, I'm infinitely interested in myself. That's narcissism for you. Like, but I really am. But I'm also infinitely interested in most things in general.
Yeah, but it seems, I mean, so here you were in your 20s, beginning of your 30s, and you develop knowledge that you're using right now. Mm-hmm. Now, when I look to our colleagues now being in their 20s, like you said to me earlier, because of the whole social media, the damage and the good that they can do is much bigger than the damage and good that we could do when we were in let's say, the first chapter of our career. How can we, mature women, support our colleagues who are now developing their signature, their stamina, their resilience within that arena? How can we support our colleagues?
This is the next sort of investigation. Mm-hmm. Like I run experiments constantly, right? Where I'm like, how can I reach that demographic and help them help themselves while helping us do this work? Because the value system is just very different, right? And they are, they understand the power. Like we didn't have a word called influencer when we were coming up, that you have a sphere. Yes, we had a sphere of influence. It was much smaller, right? It wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't global, right? And it's really interesting because where the brain is in development in your say late teens through your 20s, that's when you are like erratic, right? Where you're really reactionary, where, like you are trying to figure out who you are. And most of the time it's through rebelling and pushing boundaries. And this is when they have the most influence now, right? So it for us, it feels very reckless. I don't know, for me, it feels very reckless. When I look at it, I go, wah! But I think grounding them in the idea of the responsibility. Biblically, it says that to whom much is given, much is required, right? So the conversations I have is in trying to get them to kind of settle in to the idea of there is a great responsibility to what you do and your actions, because your sphere of influence is so broad, and that you can't look directly in front of you. You have to look down the road. Like that's why I call myself a diversity strategist, because I strategize down the road. I'm not even interested in what's happening right here. And so if I can get the youngins to understand that it's not about what happens today, that feeling of gratification of doing something like this is really temporal, but the effects that it has that's what you need to look at. And so this is a trial and error. We'll see. I mean, some people are interested. Some kids just want to take a blowtorch to everything. Some are interested in really building. But yeah, so check back with me in about 5 years.
Yeah. Hey, and last question in relation to the youngest generation of our colleagues. What do you admire the most in this generation at the moment? Because we can't change the world if we don't work intergenerationally. So what do you admire the most when you look to the youngest generation of colleagues that are out there right now?
This is hard to because, like I said, because I am fearful both for and of them, right? Especially for the work that we have been engaged in, because Peggy, you know how extraordinarily delicate it is, and oftentimes it balances on a very, very fine point, right? And of like relationships and egos and power, like it's very, very delicate. They make you nervous because they kind of like, they're energetically, they're like, ah. But I love something about that, right? I love their moxie. I love the idea that they, to a degree, are not afraid to say what it is, say how it is, right? I love that. At the same time, maybe it's generationally, I do want to be like, can we control it, like direct it more? I find them really, their creativity, like their adaptability is admirable. Like they mutate so quickly and can catch on from one thing to the other and master these sort of new ways of connecting and sharing. Like that's incredible to me. And I find what happens next artistically, like how that manifests in something like ballet, will be, I'll be interested to watch that.
Cool. Hey, very, very last question of this interview. If I connect the word well-being with equality, which quote or quotable few sentences you would like to bring into this?
Oh God. That's hard, Peggy. Not a quote. If wellness and well-being. Oh, this might not have any connection, but it just came to me. Toni Morrison wrote in, I believe it was Sula. She wrote, no, it was Beloved. Oh my God, this is horrible. But there's a line that says, basically, she's a friend to my mind. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I feel like maybe it does, because in order to get to equality, you have to, like, that's my whole thing, like flipping the perspective. You have to be a friend to someone's mind. Like you have to get how they think. You have to care enough, right, to get how they think. I think that would be it. Hold on. I'm going to actually, I want to find that quote because I think it's important. I'll do it on my phone. Because I think that it, she's a friend to my mind.
It's beautiful.
Okay, let's read it. Let's see if I can, I'm sorry. Toni Morrison. Oh, it was from Beloved. Okay, that's, I said Sulak, I went through all the books though. She's a friend of my mind. She gather me, man. The pieces I am, she gather them and give them back to me in all the right order. Ooh, should I read that again?
Yeah, and then we wrap it up. Go for it.
So Toni Morrison, Beloved, she is a friend of my mind. She gather me, man. The pieces I am, she gather them and give them back to me in all the right order.
Beautiful. Thank you, beautiful Theresa Ruth Howard, for this conversation. I always enjoy being with you. And I'm really happy that, you know, a lot of people will be able to hear you listening to this interview. Thank you, thank you, thank you.